Hello, everyone, and welcome to the AttackIQ webinar, leveraging the MITRE attack matrix to continuously validate corporate security controls, processes, and products. I'm joined today by two guests, Brant Mackey, the Director of Field Operations for AttackIQ, and a special guest, John Wonder from the MITRE Corporation. John is a Principal Cybersecurity Engineer at the MITRE Corporation, working on cyber threat and intelligence and how to detect attacks using cyber analytics. He supports MITRE's work on ATT&CK and is a co-chair of the STICS committee in the OASIS Cyber Threat Intelligence Technical Committee. He believes that cyber threat intelligence can improve security for everyone and works across MITRE's federal government sponsors and industry partners to make it easier, faster, and more effective. My name is Carl Wright. I'm the CRO at AttackIQ. I'll be your moderator for today. I think we've got some great content. And also a demonstration of some of the content we'll be talking about throughout the presentation. Please feel free to ask questions vis-a-vis the application, and we will try to get to as many of those questions during the course of the presentation. Also, this presentation is being recorded, so if any of your associates weren't able to make it, or you find it of value and like to send it to them, an email will be coming out later today with a link to the live presentation. So with that said, John, let's jump right into it. At the high level, can you talk to us a little bit about MITRE ATT&CK and what the benefit is for organizations, both commercial and federal?
Yeah, sure, Carl. And first of all, thanks to you and AttackIQ for having me on. It's a pleasure to do this. So I'll kick it off with just an intro into what ATT&CK is so everybody understands where we're coming from, and then talk a little bit about some of the benefits of where we're seeing it being used and what people are really able to improve by using it. First of all, ATT&CK is a knowledge base that describes the threat behaviors that we see adversaries using day to day to attack us. And that sets it apart from some of the other frameworks you may have heard of. One of the things that we think makes ATT&CK really distinct is that we really focus on the problem. So what are the adversary behaviors that they are using to attack us, and how do we frame those in the technical goals that they want to achieve? So this gives you a couple different benefits. One of those is that by focusing on what the adversary is doing, it gives you kind of you can step back from the specific defenses that you have in place and understand what are the problems that I face on a day-to-day basis? What are the things that I have to solve? So ATT&CK, one way to think about it is just a big old list of problems. So all of the things that your defensive cybersecurity operations have to worry about. And the way we kind of organize this and make it easier to understand is kind of across the top level, we have what we call tactics. These are the technical objectives that adversaries want to achieve. So for example, some of the tactics might be they want to achieve persistence, they want to move laterally on our systems and networks, and eventually they want to collect information from us and exfiltrate that out so that they can then do something bad with it. And so those are kind of the technical objectives, what they want to do, and then you can see down the columns, those are some of the ways that they can do it. So mechanisms they use to achieve those technical objectives. And that's fundamentally really what ATT&CK is. It's a public knowledge base. You can get to this at attack.mitre.org. We make it freely available. If those of you are not familiar with MITRE, MITRE is a not-for-profit. We operate research labs on behalf of the federal government. And this gives us kind of a unique perspective and unique insight. We get to see what's happening in industry and in government, and we then use that to really inform what goes into ATT&CK. And so in particular, what we're able to do is take a lot of really real-world data from cyber incidents, publicly reported cyber incidents and things that we're observing, and that really forms the foundation of all of the techniques that you're seeing. So if you see a technique in ATT&CK, you can be confident that based on some of the information we provide, it is something that adversaries are using, and that means it's something that you need to be worried about at some level. And that's basically what ATT&CK is, and what people are using it for. I'll get a little more into this later, but there's a few different use cases we like to think about ATT&CK helping out with. One of those is cyber threat intelligence. So as you're describing the things that adversaries are doing, ATT&CK gives you a common grammar and lexicon that you can use so that, from report to report and from day to day, you can understand really what you're facing in a more consistent basis than just reading PDF after PDF. Second of all, you can use it for adversary emulation to carry out attacks and to understand what the attacks are actually doing. And lastly, you can use it to kind of organize your defenses. And this is what I want to talk about today, which is how can you understand really where you stand? One of the big problems we face as an industry is if we were to be attacked, would we be successful at defending it? If you read a newspaper article yesterday that talks about some attack that owns some other company in your industry, if that were to happen to you, would you be able to stop it? And not knowing the answer to that is really challenging for an IT security organization. And so one thing that ATT&CK gives you is a way of kind of framing your defensive program so you have a better understanding of what it's actually doing.
So John, a quick question. I mean, we've seen a massive escalation in breaches over the last couple of years, and whether it's the Verizon DBIR report or other reports from other industry leaders that are coming out and providing pretty illuminating data on the state of affairs, we're starting to see organizations adopt MITRE ATT&CK as a framework to map against their security controls. What are you guys seeing, or how are you guys thinking about that problem and how people can specifically use it on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, in the Verizon DBIR, one of the common stats that people pull out is how long the adversaries have, so dwell time, on our systems and networks before we detect them. And this is really kind of a fundamental issue with how we think about security operations. A lot of times, at least more traditionally, we would think about building these really tall walls and sticking our most important assets within those walls and making sure our walls were shored up. And the problem is that the adversary always gets through those walls. And so we really need to take a post-compromise basis. We need to assume that we were breached and say, what would happen? What would we be able to detect of those adversary behaviors? Like, what are they doing after that breach? And do we have any defenses against that problem? So rather than just focusing on, can they breach our walls, think, if they do breach our walls, what can we do after that? We need to assume that we are going to be breached and build our defenses also under that assumption. That doesn't mean that we don't build the walls. It just means that we need to have a backup plan in place, basically, because it is so easy for somebody to click an email and they launch a word macro and all of a sudden they're in. And at that point, you have to think, what is my security program doing to solve that problem? And so as I talked about, really, what ATT&CK does at this level is it gives you a scorecard. It tells you, here's the things that adversaries are going to do. And what you then can go do is use this as a way of saying, will I detect this? Will I stop this? What do I have a control in place that would prevent it? And so that's really what ATT&CK gives you, is that scorecard to understand where you stand in the face of these attacks.
No, that makes perfect sense. I mean, in effect, the cyber defenders have to be right 100% of the time. The attackers only have to be right one time, right? So, the security market, according to Gartner, Forrest, and other analysts, is about 85 billion this year, probably reaching 91 billion next year. We're spending more money than we ever had on security capabilities, people, and processes. Why do you think we continue to have escalation of breaches when we're putting more resources in to solve the problem?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So one of the problems that we have is that we don't know what our security tools are getting us. We don't know that if we buy this new product, whatever it is, it could be a great product, but it's hard to tell, what do we actually get out of this? What are the attacks that I couldn't stop before that I can stop now because I bought this new product, or even because I put this new control in place, or because I put this new detection in place. So understanding where we stand is one of the biggest challenges. And that applies both to our own internal operations, but also as we're spending more and more money on vendor products, also understanding the value of those products and really what they're getting us in terms of our measurable ability to defend our systems and networks.
No, it makes perfect sense. So how would you like to talk about this slide?
Yeah, sure. So as I talked about, ATT&CK is a scorecard, really fundamentally, when you think about it. It tells you the things that the adversaries are doing, and what you can then use that to do is to be able to say, what am I doing to stop or detect those things? And so this is just an example. Obviously, this doesn't represent any real organization, but the way you can think about this slide is just, here are the adversary techniques that we know about. So this is actually an older version of ATT&CK. I haven't had time to update the graphic yet, but it goes all the way from, in the new version, initial access, so how they're getting in, all the way towards, how they're exfiltrating information and how they're doing command and control. So it assumes both, how they get in, but also that post-compromise perspective. And what you can then do is start to say, like, look within your own organization and say, if for example, two-factor authentication interception were to occur on my network, would I have any hope of stopping that? Would I have any hope of seeing it if it were to happen? And then you can go through each one and score that based on where your defensive security program is. And so in this example, there's a lot of things that are white. That basically means that if the adversary does that, they kind of have free reign. So they have a lot of movement there. The ones that are yellow, maybe we'll see them some of the time if they do it in a certain way or they do it using a specific tool. Maybe we'll see it. In the ones in green, we feel fairly confident that if that were to happen, we would see it or stop it. And so really one really important aspect of this is understanding where you are, but also where you want to be. So understand what's the next block that I want to change from white to yellow to green. And that's where your threat intelligence can come in and help you pick, what is the next thing that I want to focus on, using a very quantitative and systematic approach to your operations.
So I guess there's a lot of other things you could layer into this that would help an organization kind of manage risk. And so it seems to me that this is a convergence between risk management and threat management at some level. How would you address that?
Sure. So one chart I don't have here is we think about this as what our defensive operations are doing, but we also have to understand what are the adversaries doing. So if we have the ability to stop or to see software service discovery, for example, is that something that the adversary is using? Is my investment in stopping that attack worth the money I'm spending on it? And so really, that's where the risk management perspective comes in, is understanding like what is the actual threat, folding that into what do we need to protect, as well as what are the defenses in place we have to protect those things. And so you can think about building a similar scorecard here, but rather than saying, what can we defend against? You can say, what are the adversaries using? Like, what are the most adversaries doing for credential access? Well, I think we know kind of anecdotally that like credential dumping is very, very common, right? That's something that adversaries do all the time using Mimikatz. So that might be a really good place to put a security spend, is in stopping credential dumping, because it occurs all the time and it can stop them before they get any farther. On the other hand, things that we see adversaries using less often, obviously we want to have the best defenses in place that we can, but it's just not always worth the money to do some of those things. And you also just need a place to start. And so what Attack lets you do is be kind of measured and systematic about how you approach what problems you want to solve and how you want to solve those problems.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, it is probably quite amazing how many times we see a customer spend money on a security control for an attacker activity that's considered high, right? Being high risk, meaning it's commonly being used, yet that security control is misconfigured, and so the money that they just spent, isn't getting any value, right?
Sure.
So I think it's a combination of the ability to identify your risk profile, identify the security controls that you've mapped against that risk, and then measuring to see whether or not the product's exceeding your expectations, and that IT or security management is actually configured it properly.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So let's jump to kind of one of your specific areas that you focus in on a research perspective. I was absolutely intrigued when we did our pre-call, and you talked about this at a certain level. So I'm excited to hear what you have on this slide.
Yeah, sure. So I work on the ATT&CK project, and certain people on the ATT&CK project focus on our adversary emulation areas or our cyber threat intelligence areas. Really what I focus on is how do we build out detections using our security operations program to see these attacks as they occur. So this is looking less at controls. Controls are obviously very, very important at preventing the adversary or at even detecting them ahead of time. But really what I focus on is how can we see them? How can we see what they're doing? And here, a lot of times what people think of when they think of security content and kind of looking in their systems and networks for things is indicators of compromise. This has traditionally been a very, very common way for how organizations do defense. And so indicators of compromise, if you're not familiar, are really looking at what are the known things that adversaries are doing that are bad, and what are the artifacts of those things. So we know these things are malicious behavior. We've seen adversaries use them before, and so we know that they're bad. So for example, a lot of times people are sharing command and control IP addresses. So IP addresses for botnets and things like that. You share that out, you block those IP addresses or you alert on those IP addresses, and you're protected against that known attack. I like to think about kind of expanding that out though, because that gives us really good defenses against known bad, but it turns out the adversary is evolving all the time. This is the pyramid of pain concept, if you're familiar with David Bianco's chart. One of the problems is the indicators look at specific observable artifacts, and they're very easy to change oftentimes. So for example, an IP address, you can get a new IP address very easily. If there's a piece of malware, you can change that file hash very easily. And so while indicators are good at kind of looking back at known malicious, they're not so good at looking forward at what is the adversary going to do tomorrow. And so that's where I see what I call analytics coming in. Analytics is a very, very loaded term. You ask 10 people what analytics means and you'll get 20 different answers. But fundamentally, what I mean here is looking at not just no malicious behavior, but what is suspicious behavior? What are those things that adversaries do every day to attack us? And it turns out those are the exact things that are described by the attack matrix. It's moving laterally using remote desktop protocol. It's establishing persistence using scheduled tasks. These are things that we don't have any specific no malicious artifacts for them, but we know that adversaries do them every day. And the nice thing about using these analytic detections is that they are much more forward-looking and they're much more, much less brittle, I should say, because they look for these suspicious behaviors that adversaries have to do versus observable artifacts that are very easy for them to change.
No,
That
that
does
makes,
come with, yeah,
I'm
sure.
sorry. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, let's say you have an adversary that wants to live off the land, okay? And let's say that, your organization's done a pretty good job of locking down PowerShell. You only have certain users that use it. You have group policy objects that manage it. You only allow assigned PowerShell. That would be a good policy for any organization. Now, implementation of that policy could be a whole different story, right?
Sure. So one of the things that you really need to think about as you're building out all of your detections and all of your controls is how do they all kind of work together towards achieving a comprehensive defense? And so, for example, for locking down PowerShell, that can give you a good ability to stop execution, but there's other ways to execute commands. As you're saying, you might have things misconfigured, and so that your PowerShell detections or controls that you think you have in place, maybe they're only really in place in one environment in your managed desktops, but they're not in place in your servers that might be managed by different sysadmins that run your web servers, for example. And so understanding how you kind of build this comprehensively across all of your environment is really important.
Great. I know I interrupted you. You were going to make another point prior to that question.
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I just want to walk down and kind of distinguish indicators from analytics because this is a very, very common question that people ask because they know they need to go towards TTP-based detections and these behavioral detections, but it's hard to understand like what that means in practice. So if indicators are looking for known malicious behavior, analytics are looking for suspicious behavior, what are kind of the upsides and downsides of those things, and what does this spectrum look like? So one thing that we find with analytics is that you tend to have lots and lots of false positives. This is a big challenge right now, actually, in doing analytic behavioral detections, is that we are looking for things that are suspicious, but fundamentally the things that the adversary is doing when they attack us are the same things that we're doing when I manage our systems and networks. Like the adversaries are just a sysadmin that we don't pay and they're not working for us and they're managing our networks too, though. And so the things that they do are very similar to the things that we do. And that means that you have this big false positive challenge when you try to build out your behavioral analytics. And so you have to understand, you have to run tests, and you have to see what does the adversary behavior actually look like when they do it. That's why it's so important to actually run these attacks and see what they look like. It helps you understand how those attacks look different from, just your sysadmin going about their daily job. The other thing that we find with indicators in analytics is that we tend to talk about indicators as thousands or hundreds of thousands per day. You get all these analytics and you really have to automate them by using things like sticks and taxi. As Carl mentioned in the intro, I do work on sticks, and so I certainly don't discount the value of indicators and doing indicator sharing using automated mechanisms. But analytics, we get to have much lower quantity. We can focus on having a few good analytics. Maybe it's dozens or hundreds versus hundreds and thousands per day. And what that means is that we can make sure those things are right. We can work to tune down those false positives, and we can work with the security content in a much more systematic way and really see exactly what we're doing with it. And the thing that attack gives us here is attack describes those behaviors that we want to detect. And so we can build out more and more analytics to detect more and more attack techniques. And the scorecard on the previous chart, we can start to change from white to yellow to green. And so become, therefore, more confident that if an attack were to happen, that we actually would detect it and be able to respond to it.
Well, this seems like a very important concept that's rapidly evolving. Is there an example that we can use, something like privilege escalation or something like that within the attack framework?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the attack behaviors that we talk about a lot is bypassing user account control. This is one that a lot of users are actually familiar with because user account control is that kind of box that pops up in Windows when it asks you if you want to give it admin privileges. Maybe you're installing a program or something like that, and it pops up this box to ask for admin privileges. And the reason this is in place is because obviously we want to use principle of least privilege, and as we go about our day-to-day work, we want to not be an admin and then be in an admin when we need to, right? And so that's great. That's a good security policy that's in place. The problem is that our operating systems need to behave as admin all the time, right? Because they're operating systems, they need to do this admin functionality all the time. And Microsoft didn't want to pop up a box every single time that happened, right? That would really annoy the user. And so what they did was they built a way to get around this, what they call user account control, for specific built-in Windows processes. The problem, of course, is that the adversaries are smart and they figured, okay, if these programs that are built in can get around user account control, can I somehow use that? Can I use that to my advantage so that then the adversary can get admin privileges without notifying the user, and so work around that security control? And it turns out that yes, they can. There are certain things that in Windows allow you to escalate privileges. If you kind of hook into them and kind of work your way into that process, you can get around that. And so what we want to be able to do is say, okay, if that were to happen, what does that look like? In my system logs and my endpoint logging, what does that really look like in terms of events? And it turns out that there are specific events that we can look for that will tell us that somebody has tried to hook into a Windows process and successfully achieved privilege escalation through that. It will generally look like a specific process that starts. That process is a Windows built-in process that has this ability to bypass user account control, and there'll be specific command line arguments that were passed to it that kind of call the malicious code. And the most important artifact, of course, is that a process starts with lower privileges, and by the time it's done, it has higher privileges. And so it's executing as a privileged process. And so this is how you can go from understanding that there's an adversary behavior to knowing how to detect it. You look at what the attacker's using it for, you look at what the system process is actually doing, or the known behavior is actually doing, and then you try to write very specific searches in your search platforms that will let you find those things, and ideally finding just the bad and not the good. When you do find the good, when you accidentally detect things that are benign, that's called a false positive. So that's what I mean by more false positives, is if my search were not accurate enough, I might catch not just the bad guy trying to get around, but certain cases of good behavior. And that's something that your SOC has to deal with.
Well, so you've kind of alluded to a couple of interesting things. I mean, the first one is there's thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of indicators, right? But how many TTPs are there in attack that are codifying attacker behaviors?
Yeah, great question. There are 219 as of the most recent version.
So what basically, it's almost a positive security model where if I define the expected behavior of the adversary and my analytics can spot it, then I have a much better shot at shrinking the dwell time of the adversary. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, that is exactly it.
All right, so I basically have to be able to train my analytics and train my analysts on 219 TTPs, and then I'm probably going to be able to have some situational awareness and visibility that I didn't have before.
Yep, that's the idea.
Okay. Well, that I think is a perfect lead-in for kind of the second part of what we'd like to talk about, which is how do we take and explicitly the examples that you provided during your discussion. I mean, Mimikatz has been around forever, but it's probably shockingly interesting to see how many people can't detect or block that, right? As an example of a piece of a tool, and then UAC. So we're going to pull those two examples forward into the demo for credential theft and privilege escalation. And then let's talk a little bit about how AttackIQ, FireDrill platform, has codified the MITRE attack matrix and all the TTPs within the platform and can be used by organizations to launch these behavioral-based attacks against people, processes, and technology, and be able to assess their ability to detect and block these from an enterprise perspective. So real quick, a little bit about the platform. This is an open system testing platform. And what that means is we have content in the platform called scenarios. Our scenarios are obviously various Python classes that represent MITRE attack TTPs. We have a lot of other content in the platform that isn't specific to adversarial simulation, but today we'll be focusing on attack. The open system platform allows organizations to use a distributed client server architecture to deploy agents out into the production infrastructure. We call these agents test point engines. While agent is typically a bad word, these are pretty passive in nature in the sense that they don't hook into the kernel and they operate at both the user level and at the privilege level, depending on which type of attack that you are simulating that you'd like to measure your infrastructure against. Once the agent is deployed, it reports back to the FireDrill platform and it waits for a job. If there's a job or an exercise or operation for it to run, it will download a Python package that represents all the scenarios or tests that you'd like to conduct. It will run them in a temporal fashion and then report the results back in real time. All of the scenario and content in the platform is do no harm, certified by AttackIQ. And so that means you can run it on production assets and measure drift. A good example of that is one of our large social media customers who measures servers in a measurement unit called fleets, had fleets of Linux boxes, and they do regression testing on policies on a daily basis. They know from an adversarial perspective they have a problem with a certain adversary that likes to use remote shell, and so they've disabled remote shell on all these fleets, and they run a adversarial simulation on a daily basis to see if remote shell is in fact disabled. And for 6 months that was fine, but one morning they came in and they were able to use remote shell on thousands of servers. And basically what happened there was an update the night before that wiped out that policy on all the fleets. And so that's just an example of how that can be done in a production environment. We support a lot of integrations with leading security products, and obviously we want to be able to measure your ability to detect and block all these different attacks, but we want to provide deep insights into the security controls that you purchased to help you understand how to remediate and to fix these problems. And then obviously hooking into other interesting security products like Domesto and Phantom Cyber to facilitate orchestration where appropriate. The AttackIQ open platform is backed up by the AttackIQ community. Obviously our community is pretty active, submitting new content into it. We will obviously certify different scenarios that our community has published and make those generally available to all of our customers. But again, everything that we will certify out of the community is do no harm. There's definitely a lot of content in the community that's a little more aggressive, and sometimes that's appropriate. Last slide, and then we'll jump to a demonstration. We operate as a SaaS cloud first, a multi-tenant SaaS cloud. But we also have an option for our customers to deploy AttackIQ FireDrill on-prem, and we offer 2 different flavors. We support OVA for VMware, and we also support Docker vis-a-vis Kubernetes or Red Hat. We're in the Red Hat marketplace for enterprises that are moving more into the microservices and Docker environment. We certainly operate in Amazon, GCP, and Azure as well. As I indicated, it's a distributed client server architecture, and so we have agent installers for the various operating systems that are out there that you see supported on the PowerPoint in front of you today, supporting all the way back to Windows XP embedded. The agent checks in all communications from the agent to the FireDrill platform over 443 or WebSockets, and everything we do and everything Brant's going to show you today is API first and UI second. So quite a few security teams will drive their continuous security validation program via our API and programmatically from a SecOps perspective orchestrate that. I'm just showing an integration of Splunk today because that'll be in the demo that Brant provides you, but we can obviously hook into all the different SIM frames and platforms that you may have out there and using today. So with that said, that is the setup for the demo.